Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to say thank you for joining us at the Alliance for Peacebuilding working group on peace, justice, and democracy. It's co-led by Joe Bubman with Urban Rural Action, and we're so pleased that he's with us here today. We have, so if you're interested in joining the working group, we would love to have you. If you want more information about it, we'll put it in the chat. We also are holding these series of weekly conversations every Wednesday at 2 p.m. to discuss some of the critical issues that are impacting stability and causing increased instability in the United States. We wanted to put on a conference actually and pull people together, but that would have taken more time. And these issues are so critical. We want to go beyond just the 30,000 talking points, and we wanted to start getting this information and having these discussions quickly. So, which is why we're having these ongoing Wednesday series that will continue into July. So thank you all for being here. And I want to just welcome Joe Bubman and say how important this discussion is today in the peace building field, because this is our conflict. We're in it. It's messy. And when we look at other conflicts overseas, we look at all the conflict dynamics. But here in the United States, there's a focus on, looking at, let's say, social justice issues that are incredibly important, but they are one part of the conflict dynamic. And so that's why this conversation today is so important, to talk about the future of rural. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe. And once again, thank you so much for putting this together. This is a really important conversation to have today.
Thanks, Liz. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Future of Rural, addressing conflict dynamics through rural economic opportunity. As Liz said, I'm Joe Bubman. I'm the Executive Director of Urban Rural Action. Our mission is to bring together Americans across geographic, political, racial, and other divides to build relationships, strengthen collaboration skills, explore different perspectives on issues, and work together to address challenges that impact all communities. I'm very excited for the discussion today. As Liz said, this is the 6th event in the spring speaker series on preventing and reducing conflict and instability in the United States. And we're thrilled to be hosting this event alongside the Alliance for Peacebuilding and the Working Group on U.S. Peace, Justice, and Democracy. So the purpose of today's discussion is to shed some light on economic challenges in rural communities and the negative impacts of those challenges across social and political systems, but also to showcase what works. What are some of the successful approaches for investing in rural communities and the potential impact for, as Liz says, advancing a more peaceful, a more democratic, a more just society. And I just want to say a word about rural before we jump in and before I introduce the panel. There are lots of classifications of rural with significant implications for policy. For our purposes in this discussion, rural is meant to communicate smaller communities with lower population density far from large metropolitan areas. We recognize that rural does not adequately convey the range of differences within communities that we might think of as rural. And I would say that diversity within and across rural communities is often underappreciated. And so I'd like us to keep that in mind as we jump in. It's my privilege to introduce our star-studded panel. I'll start with Sherri Powell in the Catskills of New York. Sherri is the founder and executive director of the Rural America Chamber of Commerce, which is a relatively new organization dedicated to providing opportunities and visibility for entrepreneurs in rural communities with networking, education, mentorship, partnership, collaboration. It's great to have you, Sherri. Next is Don Fraser Jr. In the greater DC area. He's the Chief Program Officer at the Education Design Lab, whose Bridges program, Bridges Rural program, builds the capacity of rural community colleges to serve as engines of economic growth. Great to have you, Dawn. Whitney Kimbalco in Athens, Tennessee is the Director of National Programs for the Center for Rural Strategies. Their mission is to improve economic and social conditions in rural communities through innovative media and communications. Welcome, Whitney. And last but not least, we have Molly Powell in Asheville, North Carolina, who's the Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Development Lead for the Center on Rural Innovation, also known as CORI. They advance rural inclusive economic prosperity through digital economy ecosystems. So welcome. Let me just say a word about the flow of this discussion. We're going to start sort of a round one of questions that focus on economic challenges in rural communities, including challenges that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so I encourage you, Whitney, Dawn, Molly, and Sherri, to maybe include some remarks about how things have been particularly challenging over the past 12 plus months. Round two, we'll sort of transition to solutions. What are some of the initiatives and approaches and programs that Whitney, Dawn, Molly, Sherri, and their respective organizations have been implementing to address those challenges, and what are the impacts of that? We encourage all of you watching and listening at home to chime in the chat with constructive feedback, ideas, thoughts, reactions, and also your questions. If they're timely, I'll try to incorporate them in the moment. And if not, we will do our best to take them at the end. We do have sufficient time allocated for Q&A towards the end, and we have until 12:30 Pacific, 3:30 Eastern. So without any further ado, let's jump into our first question. I'm going to direct this to you, Whitney, at the Center for Rural Strategies, which, as I said, is an organization that really aims to improve social and economic conditions in rural communities, not just in the US, but around the world. And one of the data points that has really stuck with me a lot over the past couple of years comes from the Pew Research Center. And I think Stephanie might drop this into the chat in a moment, but 70% of people who live in rural areas say that people who live in either suburbs or urban areas don't understand the problems that rural residents face. And so my question for you, Whitney, is what is it that people who live outside of rural areas misunderstand about people who live in rural areas and the communities themselves?
Thanks, Joe. Thank you for starting with me and giving me such a big question to kick off this conversation with. So hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Kimbalco, and I'm with the Center for Rural Strategies, which is based in Whitesburg, Kentucky, which is in the coal fields of Kentucky, the southeastern portion of the state. But we're nationally focused, and many of us who work at Rural Strategies work remotely from our hometowns in rural places across the country in all 4 time zones. And I'm coming to you from Athens, Tennessee. That statistic, I had to go look at that report when you told me you might be quoting it. And something that stood out to me about, the statistic that rural people, 70% of rural people think that people outside of rural don't get what's going on with them. Mm-hmm. It also said a large number of urban and suburban folks feel that way too, that, they look outside of their bubble and they feel like people don't understand what's going on there. And I want to say that, I bring that up because I think, it's not accidental that we are a divided nation at this moment, that we've been divided and almost activated to be a polarized kind of nation in this moment. Rural America was part of a lot of incredible government programs back in the day, everything from the Great Society to the war on poverty, to the civil rights movement, to labor and union movements. And yet now rural is on the fringes of a lot of those kinds of efforts. And that's not necessarily accidental. A lot of that has to do with very strategic pulling out of rural, of industries and economies, and the globalization of a lot of those economies. It's cultural in a lot of ways too, this pulling back and pitting rural against urban, and then trying to activate the forces within those places in ways that will other one another. So it's not necessarily just a rural phenomenon that we look out and see that people don't understand. It's across the board. So I just want to lay that foundation. But then I also want to say that there are some real disparities across within rural as opposed to our urban counterparts. Everything from broadband to higher rates of chronic health to chronic illness to less access to healthcare, quality education, childcare, professional jobs, higher paying jobs. All of those things are very real, and the pandemic has certainly shown a spotlight on what disinvestment in rural has done to our economies and to our communities and to our people. The fact that we couldn't rally as quickly to ensure the services that people would need to face this pandemic, particularly broadband, which, by the way, if mine is spotty at the moment, it's a rural broadband phenomenon, especially in the afternoons here. I think, the other thing I want to say is that over the years, rural has been portrayed in very specific ways in national media stories, which we can talk more about. But that, these tropes about rural, these kind of single stories about a monolithic culture that's white, that's conservative, that won't vote in our best interests, that is a story that has been crafted, a narrative that has been crafted and on very strategically, and then we look for characters to cast in those roles is basically what ends up happening in mainstream media news stories in particular. There was even one in the New York Times most recently about vaccine hesitancy in rural Greenville, Tennessee. And when I look at that article, I think to myself, there's more extraction in that article than there is authenticity and truth. There's a level of, just looking for a way to fill in the trope that already exists, and just check off those boxes, as opposed to recalibrating the stories that we're telling about rural people and places, and making new narratives and new frames that convey nuance, that convey the complexity of the disinvestment that's occurred over a long period of time, that convey the historical participation that rural America has had in advancing really important programs in our lives, and also, that there is a heartbeat of diversity and a heartbeat of participation in rural places across the country. So those are some things I would offer up at the outset.
What a phenomenal way to kick off this session, Whitney. I really appreciate that. When we get into round two and talk about solutions, of course, you'll have an opportunity to introduce some of the new narratives and the complexifying and nuance that the Center for Rural Strategies and Daily Yonder bring to discussions on rural communities. I really appreciate your highlighting the disinvestment in rural communities, particularly when compared to the important role that you said rural communities played in the Great Society, for example, dispelling some of the misconceptions about rural America as monolithic, as just white and conservative, as opposed to diverse communities that come in different shapes and forms. And also, as you say, the connection to urban when it comes to polarization and divides in our country, and some of the attributions that people on both sides or all sides of our geographic divides make towards the other. So that's fantastic. Let me turn to you next, Sherri. As I said at the outset, you founded the Rural America Chamber of Commerce earlier in 2021. It's an organization that provides opportunities and visibility for entrepreneurs in rural communities through education, mentorship, partnership, collaboration. I have a question that's equally broad as the one that I asked Whitney, but when you think about economic challenges in rural communities, what are the ones that rise to the top? And what are some of the social and political impacts of those challenges if they're not addressed?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Joe. And just thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. Thrilled to be here amongst this esteemed panel. I don't know if anyone noticed, but when Whitney was speaking, I was vigorously shaking my head because amen to all of that. Eloquently done, Whitney. And I think if someone were to ask me why the chamber has come into existence, it would be very, very similar to what she just so beautifully outlined. The one piece of that Whitney mentioned along the terms of disinvestment and how corporate and big manufacturers have left rural America over recent decades is certainly a key to what we're trying to do. And I personally am born and raised in a small town in rural Georgia, population just over 3,000, per capita income just over $9,000. And I've seen over the span of my lifetime, my mom who worked in an apparel factory to that leaving and what that did to our town. So in so many ways, this is personal, and that story happens over and over and over again in these rural communities. And this is personal too. And I do say this on behalf of the chamber, but also as, just as Sherri speaking from my own view, I don't think that we can continue to wait for big corporate companies to save us. We are going to have to do this ourselves. And we, meaning the entrepreneurs, the small business owners in rural America, we're going to have to be the ones who are responsible for telling our stories, for creating jobs, for celebrating ourselves and our communities, for being our own advocates. And one of the things too that Whitney mentioned was along the lines of what media, the role that the media plays in this. And that's part of it. And I don't mean, I don't mean to encourage, us versus them, but at the same time, we have to reclaim our power and reclaim our accountability and then push. And so that all of that to say that's really that is the main catalyst for why the chamber exists, to own our own economic empowerment. And Joe, when you ask about what happens when you don't address these economic issues, what are the implications? I actually think the implications are what we see today. It is that divide. It's that feeling of us versus them, inferior versus superior. We're experiencing now what happens when we don't take care of our economic prosperity. And I know we'll get into this more in section 2, but I just feel like, when we talk about policy implications and policy attention, it's because it's because economically we haven't had the power or used the power to raise our voices, and we're suffering the consequences today, like right now. And that's one of again, just another issue that I hope the chamber can, as we mature, we can address on a large scale.
Thanks so much, Sherri, for amplifying what Whitney started this conversation off with. What I'm hearing from both you and Whitney is that the sort of us versus them polarized society that we're experiencing right now is really a function of disinvestment. It's a function of media narratives that portray rural communities as monolithic. It's a function of sort of writing maybe whole communities off as opposed to working alongside them. So thanks for that, Sherri. Molly, I'd like to turn to you next and hear a little bit about your and the Center on Rural Innovation's perspective. You work to close the rural opportunity gap by advancing economic prosperity through the creation of inclusive digital economy ecosystems. What is the rural opportunity gap? How would you define that? And again, what are the implications socially, economically, politically of that gap?
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and huge +1 to Whitney and Sherri's sentiments as well. So CORI, Center on Rural Innovation, exists really because we are facing the largest rural opportunity gap in history. And what that ultimately means is that rural America never recovered even from the 2008 recession. So while urban and suburban communities bounced back and continued to grow jobs, rural places failed to replace the jobs that were lost, let alone even grow their economies. And how did this happen? When we question that and we really dig into that, what we find are sort of 3 main causes that can define this rural opportunity gap. And that is automation of rural jobs. So between 2001 and 2015, manufacturing employment actually fell by 30%. And the lion's share of those jobs were based in, of course, rural economies. And then secondly is globalization. So over 200,000 computer programming jobs are being outsourced from the US right now. And those are jobs that could be for rural folks, for folks across this country, if they're, accessing the skills and the training needed to actually do that. And then the third is this 30-year decline in entrepreneurship, which we've been seeing. And that's really why CORI is sort of uniquely focused on creating these inclusive opportunities for ownership of production in the age of automation. I think that's really key. And that's a lot of what we focus on with building these entrepreneurial ecosystems. And some of the sort of negative impacts that you see in addition to and because of those 3 main drivers are, of course, this lack of funding, as well as Whitney was saying, the lack of investment that's going into folks, because that really stops the opportunities from being possible. So in entrepreneurship, you look at less than 1% of all VC money goes to rural areas. 80% of all VC investments are going to just 5 major metro cities. So how can we expect this gap in opportunity and possibility for creating companies, for getting digital jobs, if we're simply not investing the resources or the actual capital into rural entrepreneurs, rural people, and rural communities? Another impact that we see when we look really to access to employment for jobs with these increasing incomes, those again largely clustered in these major cities that are not rural. The digital economy that we talk about, it really grew so much faster than the overall economy in the last decade, and 90% of those innovation sector jobs, again, just 5 major metro areas. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the rural opportunity gap, is these statistics showing the opportunities are simply not there, not accessible for rural people. And I would say COVID over the last year, or now some change, has really negatively impacted our entire country, our world, of course, but uniquely rural America. Even before COVID, only 5% of tech jobs were in rural counties, despite these same regions representing 15% of our national workforce. So COVID, I would say, is exacerbating this, but it was already existing and really negatively impacting the rural communities that we seek to partner with and work with.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Molly. And before moving to Dawn, I just want to ask a follow-up question. I'm sort of processing what I'm hearing in terms of what you said, Molly, the automation, the globalization, the decline of entrepreneurship, the drying up of funding. We heard from Whitney about broadband issues and chronic illness and jobs problems and less access to healthcare and so on. I'm wondering if, again, just thinking about sort of conflict dynamics, does this not fuel some sort of resentment? And if so, who is the resentment directed towards? And Whitney, you sort of started the conversation by talking about both perceptions of urban communities towards suburban, rural, and vice versa. I'm just wondering what is, and again, hard to generalize, maybe you can just talk from your own experience, but is there a sense of resentment either towards state governments or the federal government, or towards urban communities that the folks you're talking about maybe perceive as benefiting from, like you said, Molly, 80% of VC money going to 5 metropolitan areas? What is this sort of emotional impact of this underinvestment, underappreciation, under access by people in rural communities to economic, social, political opportunities? Sherri, you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Well, one thing I just want to offer that comes to mind, Joe, that we hear, the chambers, we're very much in our infancy, but in our membership is growing. But even from the member base that we have now, a constant theme that comes up is even the way you define and talk about entrepreneurship. Even when you think about that one definition, as rural entrepreneurs, we feel left out of that conversation. Entrepreneur, people automatically go to tech, AI, in more digital type spaces and industries. And so it's, the maker space, we're not included in the conversations around entrepreneurship. The folks who are, the craftsmen, the artisans, when we talk about entrepreneurship, we're not even a part of the conversation. So that in and of itself is a small example of course, there's resentment. I mean, human nature, we're left out of even that basic conversation in terms of a broad definition. And that's, everyone holds responsibility in that, the media, politicians across the board. And I just wanted to mention that because it's a hot topic in our community and our member base. And, that's one of the things that we plan to build a campaign around, is just how do we even talk about entrepreneurship, and how do we be more inclusive? And that leads to funding, right? That leads to so much, but we've got to be candid about how our words and how our definitions and our behavior, the implications of that.
Thanks, Sherri.
I was just going to say, I think broadband's a really great example of that feeling of being left out and left behind, right? I mean, it's people who have a gig are on to the next task by the time, my wheel starts turning or stops turning on my internet. And the conversation so quickly moves from like broadband access and affordability to net neutrality, which is like, that's about providers throttling information or charging you more or less for where you go. Rurals, don't even talk to me about net neutrality before you talk to me about, getting me internet. Don't break the internet before I get it, if you don't mind, is kind of how I often feel. And you can, if you hear resentment in my voice, it's like, you know, this is an example of where that can come from.
Thanks so much. So Dawn, let's go to you next. And again, Dawn, you're the Chief Program Officer at the Education Design Lab. Among the many things that the lab does is implement the Bridges Rural Program, which helps rural community colleges serve as engines for economic growth. My question for you is, what are the economic challenges facing rural community colleges, and what are the social and political impacts if those challenges are not addressed?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Joe, and thank you to you and the Alliance for having me here in the lab on this panel. And of course, you know, we've just got a great panel with such different perspectives we're bringing to the table, but I think all very much aligned on what's going on here, right? As we're trying to figure out how we can lift up and create solutions for rural America. So just really quickly about the lab, we're a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. The lab is all about designing education toward the future of work. So primarily we're working with colleges, with higher education. This particular project is working with rural community colleges in 4 different states. And we've been going at this work now for about a year. And you know, part of what we did in the outset was do a scan of the literature, the great literature that's already out there. So a lot of what we know are challenges for rural America aren't a real surprise, right? And Whitney was just talking about one of them on broadband access. But we also found that there are some other things. So we looked at and grouped some themes together around what we were noticing, not just from the literature, but our own investigation and in-depth work across these 4 different states. Again, one of them is the tech, but beyond broadband, it's also lack of access to devices. So if I actually have internet, do I have devices? You know, if anybody's ever tried to do any learning, anything more than, you know, playing a game or making a phone call on your phone, if you had to take a class on your phone, it would be awful, right? But there are a lot of people that are having to do that because they don't have access to computers. Their only access to the internet might be through their phone. So we know that's a challenge. Then you're talking about just digital literacy issues for a lot of folks as well. That's not just a rural issue, but it is something that is prevalent, right? We know that, again, if I have this device, am I able to use it to its capacity? Do I know how to negotiate it? There's an assumption now that, hey, this was great. In one ways, colleges accelerated their ability to deliver education online due to COVID, but the assumption is people know how to access courses online, right, and take courses online, and that was just a huge oversight, right? So it was just a leap to providing courses, but we didn't address some of the personal challenges that people may have in trying to use their devices. Transportation, right? We know this is a huge issue as well. The colleges we're working with, some of them are serving huge swaths of territory, 9 counties, where people have to drive 2 hours to get to the campus, right? If that's your reality, just imagine how difficult that is, and what choice you're going to make when you're thinking about the basic needs, for example, particularly during COVID, right? We know that you had to make a choice about whether I'm going to fend for my family or I'm going to continue my education. If I have to drive 2-3 hours, and I'm spending 4 hours a day in a car just to take my courses, that choice is pretty simple for a lot of people, right? They're going to try to work, feed their families, stay put, particularly during a pandemic. So we know that was an issue. And it's mind-blowing because when you think of the fact that, and I read this somewhere, that 90% of Americans have a Walmart within 10 to 15 miles of their house, but you've got 31 million rural Americans that are more than 25 miles from a college or university, right? So think about the fact that institutions just have a hard time actually reaching the learners, right? They can't get to who they want to be able to work with. And then there are issues with infrastructure, people and places, space to do this good work. So those are all the challenges that we saw and are hearing about from the institutions we're working with. And if you go back to what are the economic implications, well, certainly if you're thinking about, as I do, and you believe that building a more educated society equates to building a better society, then we're having challenges there, right? Because we're not able to continue learning for folks beyond high school in some of these rural communities. So that to me is one of the biggest issues, right? That we're not able to continue educating people, building the skills they need to be competitive in today's economy. And it's a skills-based economy more now than it ever was before. So a lot of the things that we want to be able to do, community colleges just can't do them. You know, they're struggling for those reasons right now. And yet they're in a great place to be able to be that driver of economic change. And they're pulling out other folks to do it, so that they can't go at it alone. You know, they have to bring in workforce development. They have to bring in employers in the region or national employers. So it's a group effort, but they're sitting at what I believe is at the forefront to be able to make this change.
Thanks so much for laying out some of those challenges, but also the opportunities, Don. I'm going to stay with you as we now move to round 2 of my discussions for the panel and your insights. Focus more on solutions than on challenges. What you just described on was a set of challenges that rural community colleges face, not just broadband, but less access to devices that are suitable for courses, and digital literacy issues, transportation, infrastructure challenges. Assuming those challenges can be overcome, what you described was community colleges can contribute to a more educated society. And as you said, a more educated society can lead to a better society. Specifically, are there things, when you think about our society, the polarization that Whitney talked about, the violent extremism that we saw on January 6th, the feeling of being left behind and maybe not having a voice and feeling like discussion of rural entrepreneurship doesn't apply to you and so on. How can increasing economic opportunity through rural community colleges contribute to a more just and peaceful society?
Yeah. So, you know, this is a huge question, right? And community colleges, again, as I mentioned, I really think they're in the pole position here, and they could really lead on this. I mean, as humans, how we are engaged matters, right? And it can completely dictate the way in which we're going to respond. And there's a very delicate balance, I believe, we need to be able to strike when we're considering how to provide new opportunities for increased economic mobility in rural America. You know, and I think with Sherri, you mentioned it, you know, but we know that there are cherished industries, right? There are cherished practices in rural communities, but there are also opportunities to work in industries that might be less familiar to people in rural communities. And I think the community colleges, you know, they need to be able to address both sides of this. If they can do it successfully, where they're honoring and celebrating these existing traditions while providing additional paths forward, then I believe we can move the needle. But nobody wants to be force-fed, right? Nobody wants to be told they need to change, to be different. That's not the approach, right? I think we have a lot of work to do. We recently published a blog, and you know, I could put a link into the chat for this. But we describe what we learned from asking questions and listening to the experience of around 500 different learners, institutional faculty, other stakeholders. And I just want to highlight the 5 themes that emerge from that, because I think they're important to this conversation. One is many rural learners value connections to their homes and communities, and they want to feel the sense of rootedness more deeply at school. 2, learners need to feel embraced as their whole selves at their schools and in their communities. Learners want to build family-sustaining careers where they can grow, feel fulfilled, contribute to their communities. The 4th one, learners benefit from opportunities to access learning and support in ways that meet them where they're at and fit flexibly with their lives. And then the 5th one is many learners need and want greater opportunities to combine work and learning And rural community colleges have the potential to be hubs that really connect community members with learning opportunities that address regional workforce gaps. The work that we're doing, where we're getting deep in these communities, are surfacing some of what, some very validating, positive information about what rural community colleges are doing and changing the lives of the people that they're working for and with. But they're also surfacing some very hard things and difficult things for them to hear about certain populations that are being left out, right? Populations that maybe are out of their line of sight. As you mentioned at the top of this, Joe, right? There's a misconception in many places about who lives in rural communities. And we know that the demographics are shifting in a lot of places, right? So these are not the folks that have been historically served by rural community colleges. And therefore, if you want to think about how you move the needle, you have to be inclusive of all these different populations, which I think is very difficult. There's no question about it. But that's what rural community colleges are really charged to do here. I mean, I love the solution space. I could talk all day about some amazing things that are surfacing also, and I know we've got more time, so I'll save some of that. But I really do believe that there is a tremendous opportunity, but it has to be in a way that is not going in there and saying we have to fix rural America, right? That is not what we're trying to do here, right? I just think, as we've seen in like the tech industry, where we've done a lot of outsourcing of jobs in technology, we need to do insourcing, right? We need to look at rural communities as prospects for talent. And there are so many different industries now in the skills-based economy that are primed to do that, and COVID really accelerated that. So again, there's a balance, right? And I think community colleges have to accept the role of educating communities about these newer opportunities, but there has to be some trust there.
Yeah, I love that, Don. I love that balance between embracing tradition and also pursuing new opportunities. I love what you said about sort of the impact of how you engage with people in rural communities, where it's not something that's being done to them, but it's really working side by side, appreciating the richness of the assets and resources and prospects for talent that already exist, and elevating those up. Don, I'll invite you, if you'd like, to respond to Brian in the chat, who had a question about K-12 public education, which I think is maybe a little bit outside the scope of the lab's work, potentially, maybe not. Or you can jump in when we get to the Q&A. But I'd like to turn to Molly next. Don, you were just talking about community colleges as hubs for economic growth. Molly, Corey's work has to do with really seeing sort of ecosystems, startup ecosystems, as hubs for economic growth. You work with rural community leaders to grow startup economic ecosystems. And I'm wondering how that work contributes to what Don called a better society, or more specifically, a more just, a more democratic, a more peaceful society.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joe. And love what Don was just sharing, because what we actually do at the Center on Rural Innovation is, work to build capacity for this nationwide network of local rural ecosystem builders. So we are partnering with them, working alongside them, not dropping in and offering solutions, but rather partnering side by side. And some of those ecosystem builders that we work with are community colleges, actually, and play that role in their ecosystem. So love everything that you shared, Don. And I think it really builds nicely on what we see with these rural leaders who are really committed. They're rolling up their sleeves. They've been doing the work for years, for decades, and they're committed to creating this sort of sustainable digital economy. And what that really means is this sort of ecosystem that centers around innovation. And sometimes we like to talk about it in a metaphor of an innovation hub that may offer digital skills training and a co-working space and remote or distributed work opportunities and programs for startups or people who want to be entrepreneurs but don't know how to begin. All of that happening sort of under one roof, creating this one-stop shop and really a physical manifestation of the innovation economy in their community. So I think you really can't underestimate the importance of visibility, both in places and structures and in rural people actually doing this work and trying to bring this vision into reality. And based on our experience working with rural communities across the country, we've actually developed this sort of model for building this digital economy ecosystem, as we call it. And it highlights some foundational elements, some necessary infrastructure like broadband that Whitney's been discussing, and also what we call these direct drivers to help build this digital economy ecosystem. And I think that these sort of direct drivers are really, uniquely linked to contributing to a more just and peaceful society, as you asked, Joe. And I'll just quickly tell you what the drivers are, just like Dawn, there's 5. And that is scalable tech, entrepreneurship support, and incubation. So allowing for people to actually create startups, access entrepreneurship as an opportunity for them, and start to build wealth and build jobs locally. Then there's access to capital so that those startups actually have a, future, they can get some runway underneath them to scale. There's access to digital jobs, which again, I mentioned are often fostered through startups or new demand for tech workers being created with those companies and folks working remotely or with distributed organizations. That goes into the digital workforce development, number 4, which really ensures that folks have the skills that they need for these new jobs in their region or things that they can access digitally. And then finally, an inclusive tech culture. So really building that community, just like we were saying, around, bringing in the people who have maybe historically or systemically been left out of the conversations, even within the rural communities. So shifting these mental models about what's possible, encouraging people from diverse and different backgrounds to actually come in and participate in the digital economy. And that can include things like, tech meetups or regular sort of features and tech talks of diverse entrepreneurs or people actually making this happen, or a sort of community brand, a highly visible kind of event or gathering, anything you can do to really just entice people and bring them in, bring different groups of people in from the region. So I truly, really believe that breaking down these sort of political, ideological barriers, it can happen, I think slowly, but perhaps in some very subtle ways by bringing people together in these sort of shared community spaces and offering them opportunities to learn, to connect, to build companies together, to gain new skills and different skills together, and just, generally imagine a better future for their own rural community that they can co-create.
Thanks, Molly. I love that vision of building relationships across divides through collaboration, through entrepreneurship, through collaborating on economic opportunity. Sherri, this sounds a little bit like some of the vision you have for the Rural America Chamber of Commerce, which is a membership organization, as we've talked about. You work with your members to positively impact rural economies, rural communities, rural livelihoods. You do it through public policy and social policy engagement and advocacy. You also said earlier that it's not just about sort of tech entrepreneurship, but it's a broad vision of entrepreneurship, the makers, as you said. My question is, what are the changes that you and the Chamber seek through your programming, and how might those changes contribute to a more just, peaceful, democratic society?
Sure. So Joe, I would say that it's a two-pronged approach, and to the point that you just made, we are member based, and so a core part of our ethos as a chamber is to empower our members to know what's happening, right? To know what's happening on a public policy from a public policy perspective. So a lot of our programming is geared towards regulatory action, legislative action, and then in turn, how do our members as business leaders, as entrepreneurs, get involved in the process to create and push for change? And I know that all the panelists on who are here today know this. But for those who are maybe not as familiar with small towns and rural communities, business leaders hold a lot of power, right? I mean, this is even as a solopreneur with a brick and mortar on Main Street, you have a lot of influence and a lot of power. And so one of the things that we like to hold ourselves accountable for is, how do we encourage you to really lean into that power, not just on a community level, not just in your rural town, but on a national level, on behalf of all rural communities throughout the U.S. So that's really the push towards if you look at our past program and an upcoming program, and that's really what it's geared towards, is how do we educate and encourage our members to become activists, and I know that words can be a little explosive, but I'm not afraid to say it because I think that's what's needed. But it's how do we empower our members to become activists to advocate on behalf of our communities, because that's what we need now. I mean, more than ever, if you ask me. And so so we proudly lean into that responsibility, and I know in turn that will create more equity. It creates more education, more equity, more just. A more just process for all of us. And listen, this isn't just good for rural America, this is good for America, right? I mean, when we close these divides, it makes us a stronger, better, safer country. And so I always like to say that we're not just doing this for ourselves, we're doing this for the United States, and holistically. And so, you know, we all know this work takes time, and you know, and you know, there's a long road to go. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I think things are actually worse than they were 6 years ago, 12 years ago. So the journey is going to be long. But I think part of this, you know, an important part of this is being candid about the truth, right? And the division, and really figuring out how to, you know, just be bold in terms of closing those divisions. And I know that our business leaders play an important role in that.
Sherri, thanks so much for that. And I can't help but ask a follow-up question, because I think there were some really key insights that came out of those thoughts you just shared. What I heard you say was that business leaders in small towns and rural areas have a lot of influence, and that you and other leaders in rural America are encouraging business leaders to be activists. And my assumption when I was hearing you talk was sort of was be activists for investment, right? To sort of overcome what Whitney started this conversation off with, which is the underinvestment, the disinvestment, the neglect of rural communities. And what I heard you say was that can translate into a more just, more secure America, which of course I happen to agree with. I'm also wondering if you and the Chamber and peers of yours are kind of encouraging business leaders to be activists, not just on economic policy and investment, but also on social issues. And if so, what are the social issues, whether it's racial justice or other issues, that you would like to see business leaders play a more active role in?
Yeah, so I would say, Joe, it's absolutely, it's the economics and it's beyond, because I truly believe that and the boards, and I'm sorry, and the Chamber's leadership supports this, that in small rural towns, you can't just talk about economic development without thinking about the social aspects. I mean, that's just the nature of a small community. And so I think they go hand in hand. Listen, we get a lot of raised eyebrows and even criticism in the sense that we're not a traditional chamber, because we're not strictly focused on economics, and that's on purpose, because you have to do this in a holistic approach, and we stand by that. And as rural Americans, we know that, right? We live this every day. So it is the social piece, it's the policy piece. For 2021, one of our main campaigns was focused on racial reconciliation throughout rural America. The past recent years has illustrated the need to have these conversations. You know, I will say for now, it is basically just conversations. There's no action plan around this. It's just talking, right? It's two-way conversations. And to the point that Whitney made earlier, this all goes both ways. And so it's, you know, it's just talking, just dialogue at this point, which I think is powerful and needed and overdue. So it's definitely the racial reconciliation. And it's also, when we think about public policy, because we're a young organization, it's not necessarily a list of 3 priorities or a list of 5 priorities. It's just making sure that people are paying attention to rural entrepreneurs and rural business leaders, and in turn rural communities. Making sure that we're not just thought of during an election cycle. Making sure that politicians just don't come have a barbecue or a fish fry when it's time for an election. Making sure we stay on the radar and we're telling our stories, and to show why we need to be celebrated as rural business leaders, as rural citizens.
I so admire the Rural Chamber's deliberate focus on not just economic issues, but social and political as well. And I appreciate that sort of two-way communication thread that you just articulated, Sherri, which is making sure that people in rural areas are aware of state and national policies that impact them, but also ensuring that our elected officials understand the needs of their constituents in rural communities. So thanks for your work. And it's a nice segue to going to you, Whitney, and talking about sort of the urban-rural divide. You know, in my mind, having now worked on conflict in the United States over the past several years, when we talk about conflict in the context of rural America, we're often talking about these views of people who live in urban areas towards rural communities and vice versa. And some of the data from that same Pew study that was put in the chat earlier shows that majorities of people in urban areas and rural areas say that people who don't live in their community have a somewhat or very negative view of those who do. In other words, people everywhere feel like they are looked down upon. And the Center for Rural Strategies work centers in part on strengthening connections between urban and rural communities. And so I'm wondering, Whitney, what is the vision for that work? What are you hoping to achieve through that urban-rural collaboration?
That's a good question. This is a great panel. I'm having a great time. So I've just been sitting here thinking about, the revolt, the insurrection on January 6th, and how people rushed really quickly to a narrative of, well, these are all hicks and rural people, and, people from the backwoods coming out with their guns and their flags and, their complicated patriotism. And the tact that Rural Strategies took was emblematic of the way we approach our work, which is that the story for truly? And actually, what is the complicated narrative, and how can we push back on that? And so Rural Strategies, we have two big programs. We have the Daily Yonder, which is a daily online rural news source that uses data and analysis and really excellent journalism to tell rural stories for a rural audience and for our allies, our national urban partners too, that just give us a clearer sense of what's going on in rural and what's affecting rural people and places. And then there's the Rural Assembly, which is our other big program, and that is about seeding relationships between rural leaders across the country and with national platforms and national partners, making sure that we're all in communication and that we're all coming into deeper understanding of one another's experiences. And so we do that through gatherings very often. And the last gathering we did was called Rural Assembly Everywhere. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, maybe somebody could plug that into the chat, Rural Assembly Everywhere. But back to the insurrection on January 6th, the Daily Yonder took the approach of let's find out where this was a big digital crime scene. So it was not too difficult to find out where everybody on those steps came from, and it turns out that it is directly proportionate to the populations in urban, suburban, and rural. So it was by far not a rural dominant explosion of resentment, anger, paranoia. It was it definitely was reflective of the population as a whole. So that was a narrative that we could launch out there for rural people to better understand what happened, and for our urban partners to better understand, that single story that we like to tell about rural being Trump country is not helpful, and it's not correct either. So we approach our work very much around this idea that narratives and stories are what's really important. It's what drives better policy, better investment, and more understanding and empathy. And I know I've got Kieran Singh Sarah out there in the audience with the International Storytelling Center. And his mantra is that stories are what create meaning for us in our lives. And it's also how we better understand the truth as other people understand it within themselves. So Rural Strategies uses storytelling, narratives, and relationships to try to help drive a more nuanced and truer conversation. And then from that, we're able to develop more of a common purpose. And from that, you're able to develop critical mass in support of a common purpose, which then can change policy, which then can lead to more investment. So for me, the last question on my mind was, is rural America just in this moment now, when we're at this inflection point where we're going to decide who we are as a country, is rural America going to be Trump country, or is it going to be grandmother's cornbread? Is it going to be a bunch of dissenters out there, or is it going to be like fire departments and rural entrepreneurs and YMCAs and art centers and you know, and public schools, and is it part of the heartbeat of of all of our lives? So that's a small way to respond.
I love that, Whitney, and I so appreciate the Daily Yonder's emphasis on investigative reporting, nuanced reporting, complicating the narrative, as you say, and dispelling this sort of initial narrative that somehow the January 6th insurrection was carried out by rural America. Rather, and I know Liz Hume has put into the chat some data from the University of Chicago study, which found that there were demographic shifts, particularly sort of increasing numbers of non-white residents in counties where there was a disproportionate percentage of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. But that's very different from the initial narrative, which was what you're describing, Whitney, where there was this idea that somehow areas with lower population density were carrying out this attack on the Capitol.
Yeah, and I think the reason it's important to just keep saying that to ourselves is because then it becomes truer, right? The more we tell the honest and, you know, sometimes not so pretty stories, the more we all become more honest brokers, and that's where trust can live across those divides.
Yeah. So I'd like to kind of begin to transition to a little bit of a Q&A. I'm going to ask one more question, but I'm also going to be scanning the chat as additional questions come in. And I sort of want to pick up on the thread, Whitney, that you just introduced. I think too often, again, talking about conflict dynamics in the US, we focus on intercommunal conflict, Republicans, Democrats, urban, rural, and we sort of neglect what we often focus on in the international arena, which is sort of the tension between communities and the government, right? Where people often feel left behind. They feel like, oh, they are experiencing underinvestment. Their needs aren't being met by their elected officials. When we talked about the resentment that some community members might feel towards their state or federal governments. And we know that public trust in the government is near an all-time low right now. Only 17% of Americans say that they can trust the government, federal government, to do what is right, at least most of the time. And of course, limited trust in our democracy can undermine our political system, and that can therefore undermine the stability of the United States. This, of course, is not a problem that pertains uniquely to rural America. There is distrust of our government, a feeling of being left behind in urban, suburban, and rural areas alike. But Whitney, I know you and the Center for Rural Strategies have thought a lot about this problem. I know at Rural Assembly Everywhere, you had a session on disinformation. And I'm just wondering, and I'll start with you, but anyone can answer, what are the sources of this decline of trust in our government? And what, if anything, can be done about it?
Well, you know, I mean, there are different lenses to put on the distrust that has occurred. You know, a lot of it does have to do with the feeling of alienation that rural America has experienced in terms of disinvestment and in terms of being overlooked when it comes to good policy. I mean, just, you know, up until recently, and I say recently just because I've seen rural appear in more federal policy documents than I've ever seen before, perhaps, but up until recently, I feel like, you know, the Department of Agriculture was where everything lived, and all of rural was subsumed under USDA, which contributed to a kind of monolithic picture of who we are and how we want to live and how we make our living, and, you know, kind of simplified our lives, but it actually deeply complicates them because it glosses over the needs of all communities to be well-rounded and holistic. So, you know, there's that piece. And then there's also this media piece, this kind of media desert that that has emerged, where we're not getting daily doses of news that's local, that is reflective of who we think we are and is empowering and offers narratives of emergence or narratives of, you know, here's how we're working together to create this and do this. Instead, it's being supplanted by much more national groups who are doing, rip and read news that doesn't necessarily apply to small town Athens, Tennessee. But by God, it's full of, a lot of political rhetoric and leaning on moral grievances as opposed to, the everyday working lives of those around us. So there is this disconnect in the information that's meant for us to hear. And that's something that Rural Strategies is really focused on in the last couple of years, really drilling down to how do we create a media infrastructure or a platform that that is for rural, is about rural, it walks with rural, and it's not so focused on the divisions that have been strategically made also by gerrymandering and among other things, so that this is not the distrust in government is not all on the shoulders of individuals making decisions to disbelieve the election happened as it did. It really has to do with structural and systemic pieces that have been put in place, from media to policy to how we vote, that's put us in this place. So I'm hopeful in some ways that this moment it's an opportunity for us to start rewriting that narrative. It's an opportunity for us to start creating new systems of communication for one another. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that thoughtful response, Whitney. Sherri, did you want to jump in on this question?
I just wanted to piggyback on the point that Whitney made about how for so many decades, for forever, how everything rural has lived in USDA. And it's, and I think it's a great example of, we created a Homeland Security lead czar. We created a cyber czar. Why can't we have a rural czar? Why can't we have our own dedicated federal agency, that's not all ag focused? So I think it's, when you ask about why there's distrust, it's even something as, just that might seem trivial, but it's everything, right? It's just that the message that sends to us when we see, every, I don't know, the long list of rural hospitals that have closed over the past decade, and our family has to drive 70 miles to get their blood pressure checked. How can we do anything but not feel resentment and distrust? It's, and also one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, Joe, is, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't mention this, but it's just something that's been on my heart a lot lately is, the most worldly, most educated, most progressive, I'm going to even say progressive peers and friends that we have that sit in metropolitan areas who have no idea what day-to-day life is like here, right? So to your point, Whitney, it's government, it's our peers, it's everyone. It's just people just take time to understand, read the Daily Yonder, like just understand the lives that we live and just find empathy, right? So it's, so when people say like, why are you angry? Why is there so much tension, distrust? The list is long. It's, what COVID has done to these communities because of what was already in existence and how it's exacerbated the pain. I get chills to talk about it. I think about my own family. Our hospital in our town closed 8 years ago. And through the past year, I've been terrified of my grandmother being diagnosed with a positive case of COVID because the closest hospital is 60 miles away. These are people's lives, right? And so I just think that, policymakers, decision makers at the federal level, even the state level in some senses, from the state of Georgia, and the division between Atlanta and where I sit is huge, right? So it's even state, it's not just federal, but it's, it's not even a lack of empathy. It's almost a lack of, it's like, are you even trying to understand, right, the condition on the ground? So I don't know, when you ask why there's this feeling of tension and resentment and division, I just feel it's overwhelming, I think, in terms of how long the list is.
Wow. Well, thanks for that very powerful answer, Sherri, and for bringing to sharp focus in real life terms the sort of underlying drivers of this feeling of resentment. As I understand it from you, it's not just resentment towards maybe state and federal government that might be neglecting rural communities and leaving them behind, but it's also the lack of empathy, but also the lack of curiosity is what I would most glean from your remarks. A lack of curiosity from people in rural areas, people in urban areas, and maybe even as progressives and enlightened and worldly, as you say, towards their rural counterparts. So thank you for that. We have a number of questions that have come in, and unless Dawn, you were going to jump in, happy for you to do so, and then I can turn to the submitted questions from our audience.
Sure. Well, what Sherri was saying really struck a chord for me as somebody who's worked predominantly in urban America, but is really becoming more immersed in some of the, again, challenges that rural America is facing. But again, it's not even rural just writ large, right? It's break it down to the individuals, the people we're talking with, right? The stories we're hearing, the very powerful testimonials, the concerns that people have, what they aspire for and want in their lives. And when Sherri mentioned empathy, it hit me because it's really one of the core competencies that we bring to the table, right? Which, when you're designing effective solutions or trying to, it means you have to really be willing to deeply understand the community in which you're designing for. And if you can't do that, you're not going to get there, right? And not to mention, you're also not going to develop any trust with the people you want to work with. So yeah, I just want to reiterate, and say that I agree 100%, with Sherri in that we have to do a better job of wanting to hear and then listening to those stories, right? And then taking some action, but again, I think the individuals, we can't just like we can't wait for big business, we can't wait for some of the local, state, and federal folks to help us out, right? So I think there's some tremendous leaders in these communities who have the capability to step up, and with some of what everybody's talking about here today, I think can be positioned to do that. So, again, I think we have to, the agency is going to, win out here, I think, and I'm hopeful for it, but I'm also recognizing what we still have to learn broadly about rural America.
And Joe, could I just add one thing? I think it's something we've all been saying in so many different ways on this panel, is that it's, hard to talk authentically, I think, about the digital economy, building these ecosystems, closing the opportunity gap, if folks don't just have access basically to the internet or to a computer at home. So I think, what we're all saying in many ways too, is just starting at this level where we're meeting rural communities and the people that call those communities home right where they are. I have this background in social work that this mantra is meeting people where they are. That is where you begin and where you can go from there. So like Whitney's been talking about, the investment in rural communities, investing in broadband, for example, I think that's going to be huge to start to meet people where they are, just getting online, and then the world of possibilities opening there. And to Sherri's point, the empathy and I think compassion, that rural communities and rural people deserve all the opportunities that are available to all of us everywhere and more, and that can we open our eyes to that reality, to the realities that we may not understand, but try to learn that with an open heart, more of an open mind, and, to not look away, I think, and not make assumptions, but to have that compassion. I just love that we've sort of touched on that and taken that into this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Molly. And we did receive a question that I think dovetails with what you were just saying and what your peers on the panel have said. And I'm going to paraphrase. It's a question from Tony. And the question relates to this connection between economic opportunity, economic growth, and addressing resentment, addressing polarization. And so the question is, how do we ensure that our interventions enable more economic growth in rural areas and also play a role in reducing that polarization, reducing distrust? Do we think that improved economic prospects or entrepreneurship or economic opportunity will naturally do this? Or do we have to be more intentional than that? And so I just want to open that up to anyone on the panel. When designing economic initiatives, whether it's with rural community colleges, startup ecosystems, supporting entrepreneurs in rural areas, do we need to be really thoughtful, intentional about how to address mistrust, how to foster empathy, how to reduce an us versus them polarization, or is that a natural byproduct?
Again, let me just quickly chime in here. I certainly don't believe it's a natural byproduct. I think intentionality is what we have to strive for. It is to the points my colleagues made earlier about the distrust. Right? This would only be, I would imagine, increase if if we're just trying again to change, right, and to bring opportunities without recognizing and listening. A lot of what we're hearing with some of our community college partners is we know we can't build it and hope they come, right? That's just not the approach that they can take, right? Particularly when dollars are tight, you can't roll those dice. So it really is about trying to more deeply understand, talk to, get into the community. They're recognizing like we may have to drive a ways, right? But we have to do this. We're going to go to community fairs, for example, and make our presence known and set up a table and talk to people, right? Even the folks who live there are recognizing this is what they have to do when they represent higher education, which in some ways in some of these communities feels like it's a bridge too far for them. So they're representing that world in many ways, right? That I think we do have to be very intentional about it. And if it means bringing in industries that we're experiencing a lot of growth, like say cybersecurity, I mean, that might feel like science fiction to people. Like I can't imagine working in cybersecurity potentially because again, I don't even have access to the internet, right? But there's opportunity there, and these employers want to be able to find the talent in some of the rural communities. That naturally is friction. And if you do not address that head on, you can't get out in front of that. It's never going to work. I mean, it seems very clear to me from where we sit working with community colleges.
I love this question. I think it's one of those that could be a whole, panel discussion, for a whole session about, what does intentionality mean and what does it look like? And you don't just throw money at people and without understanding, and offering accommodations and, assistance and, understanding how to help people grasp it and run with it. And if we don't have broadband, for instance, all this money that's coming down through the rescue plan, for instance, I mean, rural is going to receive a lot of those funds for all different kinds of projects. But if you read in the, the fine print, there are a lot of barriers to actually tapping into that money for local governments, for utilities, for, just signing up for the emergency broadband benefit. My household qualifies. I tried to do that the other day and, I ran into a provider problem. And that's something that, so just throwing money at us is not the, the way to approach all this. I also think of just, another analogy is like women's bathrooms. Like I really, it's one of those things like if we'll just build a bathroom, it's all anyone needs. But like, I think about all the stuff I got to bring into that stall and the little kid that's going to be standing in front of me. And can't you make that stall just a little bit bigger? So just in general, I just think, all of our communities are in need of architects of the future that can, take into account what the real needs are and what the barriers are to taking hold of those opportunities. The final thing I'll say is that we haven't said, I don't think on this panel yet, the word equity, and that rural is a part of equity. Should be part of conversations about equity and how we achieve it and what it looks like, and that rural is has its own set of topics and issues, and that it totally fits in those frameworks, equity frameworks. So
yeah, I love that, Whitney. So much to respond to there. But I'll just say that I think your description of the women's bathroom challenge also brings the word dignity. And actually, I read a great column by Nicholas Kristof recently about the shortage of public bathrooms, clean, public, accessible bathrooms in the United States compared to many other countries. And it's It's a very unfortunate reality. I also just want to sort of echo what you said on equity, that I think when we're talking about equity, we should also be thinking about geography, and we should be thinking about population density, and we should be thinking about how we ensure that people have are given opportunities to achieve equal outcomes regardless of the type of community they live in.
Yeah, and I think the reason rural's been written out of that conversation is because of the narrative that we are all white. And I'm not saying that that's a, it's not, I'm not saying it's a racism piece. It's just a, there's no need of equity if we've got a bunch of white people in our backyards. But the truth is that rural is incredibly diverse. And, where I live in East Tennessee is very different from the Delta, from the borderlands in Texas, from the deserts, Pacific Northwest. It's just, from reservation life. So, you look at one rural community and you've just seen that particular community. And I will say that federal dollars and federal grant making is not necessarily built to appreciate the varying needs of equity that that exist in all these smaller communities. So we've got to have other ways of addressing economic need and opportunity than just throwing a bunch of big amounts of money on top of it.
Sherri, did you want to jump in as well?
I was just going to say I completely echo both Dawn and Whitney's comments, and just in terms of thinking about economics and intentionality, you have to have both. And one of the things, Whitney, you kind of touched on this earlier when you said that lately you've seen more coverage of rural related to policy than almost ever before. And my deepest hope at this moment is that the top is blown off all of it, and that conversations like this start to happen more, where we're, call it out for what it is, right? Because there's a lot happening, and there's a lot, there's just a lot of mess. And we have just got to start talking about it in plain, candid terms. So in addition to giving us money, let's have some real, candid, hard conversations, and let's call them out let's speak in plain terms, and let's move forward. I mean, I just feel like if we don't take advantage of this moment that we've all lived through, then I don't know when the right moment is. I don't know. For me, 2020 it just gives us all permission to just let it out and then act accordingly.
Absolutely. I love that, Sherri. Really quick, Joe, I just wanted to say 100% agree to Dawn as well, saying, it's not if you build it, they will come. We talk about that all the time in working with rural leaders. One of our drivers, like I mentioned, is this inclusive tech culture building. How can you build a culture that's intentionally from 0 to 1 by design, inclusive and intentional about creating this equitable ecosystem? And in fact, we straight up say it's not about trying to copy and paste and replicate a Silicon Valley in your community, because that's not equitable. That wasn't intentional. So we have the opportunity, like Sherri's saying too, to blow things up, to do things differently. When we sort of can start from scratch, we can build, I think, better systems, better communities and ecosystems to bring folks in. And that's an opportunity that actually really excites me about working, with and in rural communities.
Thanks, Molly. And let me follow up with you on a question from one of our attendees, which is sort of narrowly on VC investment, because you highlighted, this came in a bit earlier, but you highlighted earlier some of the inequities in terms of VC investment in rural communities. And the question is, does the ROI, the return on investment required by VC investment, exist in the rural areas? And so I'm curious, right, how is your explanation, what is your explanation for the underinvestment? Is it in part an ROI issue, or is it just we don't recognize, as Dawn said, that there are real prospects for talent in rural areas, and there's just been a neglect because of certain assumptions that are made?
I would say largely the latter. And in fact, one of the benefits, though, again, the tragedy that is COVID, one of the benefits is now more than ever, VCs are willing to take Zoom meetings with people anywhere. You don't have to be within a 10-mile radius of Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley. So I actually think that we may start to see that change. I think rural faces this, really deeply entrenched stereotype that there isn't there aren't innovators, there aren't technologists, there aren't high value startups there. And that's not true. And we can point to lots of examples. Look at what's happening in one of our communities, Durango, Colorado, or in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or in Bozeman, Montana, just places to Google for after this. But there are these emerging startup ecosystems that have already seen exits, already seen millions of dollars of value and, you know, returns going back to their investors in their community. And it's a little slower, and you may not see the billion-dollar unicorns, but that's also maybe not necessary, right? So I think it's about our mindset shift as well of why are we really valuing growth over everything when ultimately what we want as well is sustainability in the community and folks to access this opportunity, you know, in ways that they never have before. Women, people of color, we need to see that kind of intentional inclusion and investment in new entrepreneurs all across this country, especially in rural. So I think it's, you know, a little bit true, but largely the latter of just this myth holding folks back.
Great, thanks, Molly. So I'd like to suggest that we wrap up our panel discussion with the opportunity for each panelist to share one thing in 60 seconds or less that you would like those who are watching this live or watching the recorded version of it to take away from this conversation, or one thing that you think people sitting at home hearing about underinvestment in rural communities, assumptions that are made about rural communities, the opportunities that exist through rural community colleges, startup ecosystems, and so on. One thing either that folks can do, or just one thing you hope that they will take away, and whether it's looking at some of the emerging opportunities, as you said, Molly, in places like Bozeman, Montana. Who would like to start?
I'll start, and I'll be incredibly brief. And you know, if I can impart one takeaway, it's just to know that there's so much to celebrate in rural America. There's some really good stuff happening in rural communities. And so for folks who don't have the privilege of living in a rural community, I would say, you know, just pay attention, be open to exposure, and then join us in celebrating, because there's a lot of good stuff. And it's not just folks, you know, something else I've been thinking about is how suddenly there's a lot of attention because there's so many folks leaving the city and their exodus to rural America post-COVID. I always like to say that the good stuff has been happening before that. So just know there's a lot to celebrate, and you know, just the Daily Yonder is a great source to see these incredible stories. So there's good stuff out here.
I was looking, Sherri, for the celebration icon, but I think that's not a feature of the webinar format, maybe just meetings, but I really like that sentiment. Dawn, Molly, Whitney, it looks like you want to go ahead.
Oh, I was looking for the celebration icon too. Well, I hope that this conversation has challenged even some stereotypes you might have, our audience might have had about rural people, places, and even those of us who live in rural are stereotyping one another, in part because of the tropes and narratives we've been fed for a long time. So I think to get a glimpse of that more nuanced picture, I think the Daily Yonder is a great resource, dailyyonder.com. I also want to invite all of you to a free event that the Rural Assembly hosts, now called Rural Assembly Everywhere. It starts again in October. It's October 19th and 20th. And it's an all virtual event, and it's a celebration. It's the celebration that Sherri was talking about over rural culture, and also, having those hard conversations that Sherri also was talking about. And we like to feature partners like Molly and Dawn and others who are leading that narrative change in those important conversations.
Thanks so much, Whitney. Great resources with the Daily Yonder and Rural Assembly Everywhere. Molly, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say if you're, I love the way Sherri put it, if you don't have the privilege of living in a rural community, then, just challenge yourself, like Whitney's saying too, consume Daily Yonder, consume more content to give you different perspectives and different stories about what the reality is like for rural communities across this country. And they're all different depending on their cultures and their context and their history, but just just be open and be willing to consume that and to challenge those stereotypes that you hear both internally within yourselves. You see something on the news or that you hear from your other, folks in metro areas, friends. And if you're in a rural area, I would say, if you're not already doing it, seek out the people who are creating the future, who are holding these visions, because I guarantee you they want more folks to, join them on the dance floor and create this community and build that with them. So find those people, show them that you support and you're behind them, because it will take all of us in the various ways that we can, I think, to do this work and make the changes we want to see.
Thanks, Molly. Don?
Yeah, I think that from our perspective, the kind of unique world where we straddle between the world of work and the world of learning is that it seems that really due to COVID, there are more people willing to partner in ways that they haven't considered before. That people are moving past some of what they used to do and are exploring new possibilities, right? Which means that if you're in a position where you can build new partnerships, that you should take action, right? Because I do feel right now people are more open than they ever were, in the same way Molly just talked about, Zoom and VCs. I think there are people that are just willing to have conversations in ways they didn't have before. So to Sherri's point about what 2020 did for us, right? We have to move now. And so I just want to stress that we should be urgent in the work that we're doing here, and that we should try, and we should not assume that people won't take conversations right now and really come to the table with new ideas and new partners.
Thanks so much for that, Don. And with the close of this session upon us, I'll share my own hope that participants take away, which is that this session in and of itself might contribute to shaping the narrative. In thinking about, again, our world of conflict management and conflict analysis and peace building, when I hear about rural America in that context, it's often in the frame of the decline of rural America. And instead, I think this is a vision of the future of rural America. It's an opportunity to, as Sherri said, be laser focused on challenges, celebrate what already exists, and then support, as you were saying, Molly, support those who are leading the charge in rural America to create a vision for a stronger, more economically prosperous, inclusive society. So I want to thank you all, Molly, Whitney, Don, Sherri, for your expert insight.